This is episode number 17 with Lawrence Neal.
I literally went from exercising 8 to 10 times a week to 1 strength training sessions per week, which was very intense, and as a result had to be quite short in duration, so it was about 15 to 30 minutes. So suddenly I had all this time back, which I could use doing things I enjoyed and being more productive in other areas of my life.
Welcome back to another episode of Anchors of Health, where it's all about helping you achieve the best health you possibly can by focusing on 4 main anchors of health, which is mindset, nutrition, movement, and recovery. It's all about finding what works for you, and I'm here to help you find that. I'm your host, Bill Choi, and today's episode is under the movement category with Lawrence Neal, who has a blog and a podcast called The Corporate Warrior, which focuses on high-intensity training, not to be confused with high-intensity interval training, which is a different protocol entirely. It's a method of strength training that's been around for a very long time, and there's a community of people that are really into this type of training, but I would say the general public doesn't know too much about it, which is why I wanted to bring Lawrence on the show to talk all about this. If you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time to work out, or maybe you're spending too much time working out and want to be more effective and efficient with your training so that you have more time to spend in other areas of your life, this may be the style of training for you. If you want the show notes to this episode and everything we discussed, just head over to anchorsofhealth.com/17. Also, if you want my key takeaways from every episode, just head over to anchorsofhealth.com and sign up for my exclusive email list. So let's just jump right in. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Lawrence. Lawrence Neal, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. It is a pleasure being here.
The pleasure is mine. Now, you started the Corporate Warrior podcast and blog after having an epiphany that redefined what you consider to be effective exercise. Can you walk our listeners through your story of what exactly happened and what that realization was?
I was in a position probably very similar to a lot of your listeners. You know, I had a very busy career in IT sales, in technology sales in the UK, in London. And when I started that career, I was also very obsessed with health and fitness and nutrition and trying to stay in great shape and also trying to optimize muscle gain and things like that. So I would work out, you know, sometimes 8 to 10 times a week, doing all sorts of different crazy things like strength training, high intensity interval training. I would do like, you know, long 90-minute runs, 10Ks, basketball, all sorts of things. And I also had this kind of Spartan inspired diet, which I learned about reading a book called The Spartan Health Regime, which was a very impactful book, an impressionable book on me, but really got me it was my kind of segue into kind of hunter-gatherer diets and simplistic training methods. And that book, the nutritional aspects of that book were very much based on the kind of research by Weston Price, who went around and looked at the health of, you know, various civilizations all over the world in terms of all the indigenous tribes and stuff.
Right.
And so my diet was very kind of high in fruit and was kind of lowish in protein and I think void of a lot of the nutrient dense foods that I eat now. So what you had there was basically this very, very frequent and intense exercise regime, this diet that actually left me feeling hungry a lot of the time. And I was trying to succeed in my career, and I was super ambitious, you know, really wanted to succeed in sales and IT and climb the ranks. And I just had very limited energy day to day to do that. And this also meant that I had no time for anything else. So my social life suffered, my friends didn't really like me very much, my romantic relationship suffered. I just didn't have time for any of this other stuff. So then one day I stumbled across a video on YouTube by a men's sort of self-improvement conference called the 21 Convention. And the speaker was a guy called Dr. Doug McGuff, who the listeners may be familiar with. Bill, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
But cool. So it was one of the most it was probably the most impactful presentation I'd ever seen in terms of someone standing up and actually talking about what is exercise, how does it affect the body, how does it change the body, and how do we incorporate into our lifestyle for optimum results. And it just blew me away. I had never seen it being articulated so clearly. And immediately straight after that presentation, I bought Doug's book, Body by Science, and I read that probably in a day. And then immediately overnight, I completely changed my exercise program program. And this is going to sound crazy, but I literally went from exercising 8 to 10 times a week to 1 strength training sessions per week, which was very intense. And as a result, had to be quite short in duration. So it was about 15 to 30 minutes. And in fact, the more advanced I got, the more it reduced down to kind of 5 to 10 minutes. And then I would play basketball once on the weekend. So suddenly I had all this time back, which I could use doing things I enjoyed and being more productive in other areas of my life. At the same time, I started really embracing kind of a more paleo way of eating, if I'm going to use a label, but I'm not strictly paleo now, but I just increased my concentration on nutrient dense whole food and more protein. And I found that this was a far more enjoyable way to eat and helped me get a much better body composition. So as a result of this, I had a lot more time back. I had more energy. I had improved my previous in terms of strength gains and muscle gains. So I was happier in myself. My career took off. I went on to another company after that, and I became the top salesperson, and I was successful in closing multiple multi-million pound deals in that career, which ultimately helped me helped serve as the investment vehicle for my side hustle, which is obviously Corporate Warrior, which is my blog and podcast, and then enabled me eventually to obviously transition to doing this full time, which is what I do now. And the rest of my life also improved. So my friendships, my time for my friends was greater, and my social life got better. I met my now partner Aisling. We've had a 5-year relationship, and we're now living together in Ireland. A lot of these things wouldn't have been possible had I not made that huge shift in terms of my lifestyle. So that's the kind of long-winded version of the story.
When you look back, how many hours would you say that you dedicated to exercise or fitness?
Oh my God, like
per week?
Easily
per week.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I would say somewhere around 8 or 9 hours a week.
Okay, and then what percentage of that, or I guess what part of that, was dedicated to just lifting weights?
Probably about a third. So I would do strength training kind of 3 times a week. I would do kind of a split routine. So I have actually mostly consolidated that into what I now deem as being a more kind of effective and focused version of that strength training in a single session.
So prior to the HIIT that you used, what did that look like?
Yeah, so it would be kind of a Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing. So it would be a split routine. So Monday would be I must say that what we're talking about now was an evolution from what I used to do before that. So before that, I was doing much higher volume training. So your traditional kind of, 4 or 5 times a week, lots of sets and reps, full body every time, that type of thing. So I had moved on from that. And so this routine that I'm talking about now was, in terms of the Spartan health regime stuff, was chin-ups and bicep curls on the Monday. Wednesday would have been deadlifts and squats, and Friday would have been push-ups and overhead press. So it would have been split up like that. So it was relatively low volume compared to what I was doing previously, but it was just split up. And I would also throw in things like abs and neck work with manual hand resistance, stuff like that in those sessions as well.
Then you transformed into doing more of this HIIT style training, which stands for high intensity training. And it's not high intensity interval training, which people may be confused with. So I really want you to break this down for our listeners so they can understand what this is. Can you first start off by giving us maybe just a broad overview of what HIIT is, and then maybe I can ask you some specific questions around it?
Absolutely, happy to. So yeah, I mean, obviously, high intensity training is highly ambiguous, right? It's been so overused to be underdefined in
yeah, I actually don't like the name.
No, I don't either. Neither do. I just got off a podcast actually with a leading scientist in resistance training, a guy called Dr. James Fisher in the UK, and he can't stand it because it's so ambiguous. He prefers evidence-based resistance training, which is a far more accurate, and people seem to understand that quicker. But essentially, this type of high intensity strength training that we're talking about was really popularized by an inventor and entrepreneur called Arthur Jones back in the 70s and 80s.
Right, Nautilus. Yeah.
That's exactly, yeah. So you guys are probably obviously far more familiar with Nautilus and MedX and the businesses that he founded. And that movement really influenced resistance training on a big scale. But I think with all of the kind of mass media that kind of promoted lots of other different resistance training protocols, and some of those being relatively unsafe, it kind of muddied the waters a little bit. And unfortunately, the kind of fundamentals of high intensity training have got lost a little bit with all of that, I believe. So that's kind of that's the genesis, I guess, of high intensity strength training. And obviously there's still a high intensity training community who are kind of preaching those principles and educating people. And then especially where you are, there are plenty of high intensity strength training facilities, and where people really focus on this type of efficient strength training far more versus the UK. I don't think there are any in Ireland, so there are lots there. But do you want me to kind of elaborate on exactly what it is now in terms of the protocol and that type of thing?
Yeah, perfect. Take us through that.
Yeah, sure. So a typical, because people might be hearing this and going, just sounds like strength training. What's the difference? So a typical high intensity strength training workout would be, to describe it simply, would be something like a big five. So a big five would be a pull down, so finger lat pull down machine, followed by a chest press, a seated row, an overhead press, or a leg press. Now, it doesn't have to be on machines. You can still do the protocol with body weight or free weights.
Yeah, can you also give an example of what that looks like for free weights and body weight?
Yeah, sure. So free weights would be something like a bent over row, so like a barbell row, followed by a bench press, maybe an overhead press of a barbell, and then a squat and a deadlift. So that would be another version. That would be kind of an alternative free weight version of the big five. And then for body weight, you could do a chin up, followed by a push up, followed by a bodyweight row on something like a TRX, followed by a pike push-up, which would kind of replace the overhead press movement, and then maybe a bodyweight squat or a wall sit or something like that. So as you can see, those free workouts cover the entire musculature. Now, hopefully, some of the listeners will be familiar with those types of exercises, but the basic premise of high intensity strength training is you are going through all of those exercises with, in most cases, a single set to muscular failure. So you'll move relatively slowly compared to traditional training, and you'll go through your set relatively slowly with nice smooth turnarounds of good form. And then once you reach muscular failure or momentary muscle fatigue, you obviously want to give up because it's very uncomfortable at that point, but it's important that you continue to contract for 5 to 10 seconds at that point to really make sure you're driving a deep level of fatigue. And then once you get there, you put the weight down, set the machine down slowly and move on to the next one and repeat the protocol. So there's not a great deal of rest between exercises, just enough so that you can kind of catch your breath. And what you find is that when you go through a big five like this, through any one of those modes, you're going to be so fatigued at the end of it that you won't have the capacity, the physical capability to actually do any more work. So by necessity, it has to be quite short in duration. And also due to the amount of fatigue that you'll induce, it's not something that most people, and this varies very much depending on the individual, can do on a daily basis. You really need, in most cases, 2 or 3 days, depending on the intensity of your particular workout, to actually recover. And there may be no additional benefit to training more than 2 or 3 times a week for most people. And you could even get away with once a week and you're still going to get great results. I just think if you're going to try and obtain optimal results, so if you're part of a camp who are have a bit more time and want to optimize muscle gain and things like that, then you may want to train perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, but you can get absolutely excellent results with once a week.
Great. So let's break this down a little further just so our audience knows exactly what you're talking about. So let's go back to that rep speed. So how many seconds are they doing here on the concentric and the eccentric, the raising and the lowering?
So I don't like to give a specific cadence or rep speed. Some people in the high intensity training community kind of preach a super slow cadence, which is a 10-10 speed. So 10 seconds up, 10 seconds down. Obviously, all of this varies depending on the exercise. But if we kind of take a chest press, for example, so you'll be pushing out 10 seconds on the concentric positive part of the movement, maybe a 1 second pause at the end, and then you would turn around at the end smoothly, so there'd be no pause. And there'd be a 10-second negative or eccentric portion of the movement. And then maybe a slight pause at the stretch at the bottom. So maybe that's a 10-1-2. So that one would represent the 1 second pause. But the way I like to do it is I like to move slowly enough that I'm not really thinking about my cadence. I'm just thinking about, okay, so long as at each end of the movement, I'm moving with a really smooth turnaround, I'm not fussed if the middle of that exercise is fast. And so that could actually result in maybe a 2-2 cadence, for example, to begin with. Obviously, this also depends on the piece of equipment or machine you're using. If you're using a machine which is very, very low friction, then you can move much slower and it's easier too. But what tends to happen is if you don't try and work to a specific cadence, by the time you get to the end of your set, you're going to be so fatigued that your cadence is going to be 10-10 or 15-15 anyway, no matter how fast you try and be, because you'll be so fatigued. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you pay attention to the total time under load?
That's correct. Yeah. So I do personally. So I measure time under load. So I actually time my sets. So I hit a stopwatch at the start, and then I'll do the exercise and hit the stop, and then I will record my time under load, or some people call it time under tension. You can count reps. It's purely personal preference, but I just think that time under load is a more accurate representation of your performance. And if you ask a lot of people, just go back to your original question. If you ask a lot of people in here, I think probably most people would kind of advocate a 4-4 cadence or something like that, which kind of ensures that the trainee is moving with a not too slow, but with a safe speed of movement. Because another thing about high intensity strength training is there's a big focus on preventing any injury. We want exercise to increase strength, increase muscle mass, improve that shock absorber, which is muscle and connective tissue. We don't want to actually injure you in the process.
Right. So the reason why I ask about the time under load, because I want people to, I guess the people are going to try to ask themselves, what kind of weight should I use for that particular exercise? So say the seated chest press, right?
Sure.
How much weight? Because obviously if you're using a really light weight, I mean, you'll be there all day doing time under load.
That's
so you
right.
want to pick a weight that's kind of challenging, right? So can you kind of give them direction as to what should they aim for in terms of figuring out that proper weight to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always forget. That's an important point. So yeah, you'd want to kind of, perhaps before you do your working set, you really want to figure out your 1 rep max. So you want to kind of work out, how much weight can you lift for 1 repetition, as much as you can. And then you want to take that load and then probably take 70% of it is my suggestion. Because you're quite right. If you're using a load that's too low, you're going to be training forever. And that is a real sufferfest, especially when you're trying to train to failure. It's not very nice at all. You really want to reach muscular fatigue within kind of 60 to 90 seconds or 8 to 12 repetitions. So if you pick a load that is around 70% or 80% of your 1 rep max, then you're probably going to pick a load that's going to recruit all of your muscle fibers and stimulate those, which is what you want, which is the goal, but do so in a time efficient manner.
Now let's jump to muscular failure. What point of fatigue should a beginner target?
Now, I've noticed that some people, definitely beginners, will struggle unless they're supervised to reach muscular fatigue in the first set, because it does take a certain amount of tolerance and self-discipline to do that. It's not obviously a very comfortable experience. It's very safe, and so long as your form is correct, but it is not the most fun thing to do. So I think if you're someone like me, I'm a bit of an outlier. I kind of like discomfort if it means I'm going to improve. I'm quite happy to exercise to muscular failure, and certainly the goal should be failure. And failure, what I mean by failure is when you get to the position of movement where you just can't seem to move the resistance or weight any further, and it's at that point that it's my opinion that you should contract for 5 to 10 seconds longer in order to sufficiently fatigue that muscle, just to know that you've got it. You flick the switch, so to speak. However, if you find it very difficult to go to failure on the first set, do another set. I'm not dogmatic about that. And I don't think, there are many people in high intensity training that would say the same thing. At the end of the day, if you're doing 1 set versus 3 sets, it doesn't really matter. It's just sometimes it can be easier to essentially get to muscular failure or get to a level of fatigue if you're doing multiple sets. Because if you're doing, let's say you do the 1 set and you can't quite get to failure just because it's too uncomfortable or fill in the blank. Take a few seconds, go back maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds, go back into a second set, do it best you can again to get to failure. And then if you need to do a third set, go for a third set. And you'll find that as far as you can go on that third set, it's probably going to be enough. Even if you don't quote unquote get to true failure, you're still going to induce enough fatigue that you're going to stimulate the same response than if you had gone to failure on a single set. So I wouldn't get too hung up on I must get to failure in one set. So long as you can either do that, get to failure in one set, or get very close on 2 or 3 sets, you're going to get the same outcomes.
Right, because I guess in Body by Science, they actually recommend no warming up at all, right? And just going straight into this, right? Isn't that the way that is typically?
That's correct, yeah, because I know Doug would be laughing if he heard this because he has to defend this all the time.
Right.
And I think the thing is, it's got to be looked at within the right context. So, he's often training people on like MedX and Nautilus equipment, which has very, very, it's a very sophisticated equipment where you can jump straight on it without a warm up. And because the machines are so well designed and very safe, you can contract very gradually. And basically the beginning of your sets for all of the different exercises serves as the warm up. However, some people like to warm up just, for personal preference, just because it's a psychological thing. They need that certain amount of readiness before they get into a strength training protocol. And also the same goes for if you are using basic equipment, barbells and things like that. Some people may prefer to do a little bit of cardio in advance to warm up their body, or maybe do some very lightweight training. It's completely down to personal preference. Me personally, I don't warm up. I am fairly advanced for myself, at least, so I feel quite comfortable just going straight into my workout. I tend to do a body weight routine at the moment, and I usually start off with something like a chin up or a push up, and I find that first set done correctly will warm me up sufficiently.
Right. And some other ways that people could probably warm up, I'm just thinking, so if they chose those 5 exercises, maybe run through them really quickly at a pretty light weight really quickly, and then you can maybe go back to the first exercise and just do that to failure. Yeah,
I didn't see any problem with that. Yeah, I mean, there are 1,000 combinations of warm up you could do. I mean, what's the goal, right? Just to get those muscles just to get yourself feeling warm and feeling physically capable, right? And feeling confident. So whatever that means for you, I mean, that could be, exactly. You could run through the 5 exercises. You could jump on a cross trainer as well, or a bike. And it's really down to the individual.
And on this topic of failure, while we're here, let's just talk about some safe ways that people can implement some of these exercises, especially with the free weight exercises, like maybe the bench press. We don't want people failing on the bench press. So if they're in the gym, what are some strategies that maybe I'm seeing here? The bench press and probably what else here? Maybe the squat, where people can kind of go to failure. So can you give them some maybe pointers there on how they can take that to failure without getting injured?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously these are really important points. You're a qualified personal trainer, Bill, so you know this stuff. So yeah, I mean, obviously it goes without saying you'll want a spotter, someone who knows how to spot properly for both a bench press and a squat ideally. And the very least on the squat, you want the safety pins that pop out the bottom of like a power rack. So most gyms, I'm sure it's probably the same in the US.
Right. Yeah. Every gym here, we got them. Yep.
Oh, sweet. Okay. You have a big power rack, which is basically a big frame that holds the barbell. And then they should have big bars that come out the bottom that you can adjust to catch the bar, if you were to fall. And what you often find doing a protocol like this is that the sticking point in a squat is coming out the bottom. Everyone knows how hard that is. And once you hit failure, which is going to be in that bottom position, hopefully you've got the safety pins there and the bar can just literally sit on those and you can just roll your head out from underneath and get out safely. But that's obviously ideal. I mean, an upgrade to that would be having actually someone there to sort of stand behind you and just help you lower the bar at the end. And similar in the bench press, you want someone there to help you put the bar back onto the hooks at the end of the exercise.
And actually, you could actually do the same thing with the bench press in the rack as well, right? With the pins.
Correct. Yes. So good point. Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the frequency. You kind of talked about this a little bit. Let's talk about frequency and how frequent these workouts should be done. What's your experience on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point. So it's just something that gets discussed a lot on my own podcast. I will say that I just want to say that everything I have said, I am not a personal trainer. I'm just someone who's very, very obsessed and passionate about this way of training. But a lot of what I've said is parroting some of the people that I really admire, such as Dr. Doug McGuff and Drew Bay and the guests I've had on my podcast. So I just wanted to caveat with that first. But I have obviously been training for a while and interviewed people on the subjects of volume and frequency. And I have a lot of discourse with people online about this. There's a huge sort of genetic component involved. Some people can get away with training very frequently and still get great results. Others have to train much less frequently. Otherwise, they'll overtrain. And some people need to train with greater frequency and volume just to get gains. So it does really vary depending on the individual. And you do have to kind of start a training protocol maybe once or twice a week and then adjust. And what happens as a beginner is if you're a beginner in strength training generally, then you're not going to be very strong. So you're not going to actually be able to do that much damage to yourself. And you'll see great progress. Everyone's going to see their numbers in terms of the weights they're using jump significantly over the first few weeks and probably the first few months. And a lot of that is obviously kind of neuromuscular adaptation. You're getting better at the skill of whatever lift you're doing. And then kind of hypertrophy comes kind of after that or after some of that. So you're going to see great gains then, but then after a while, you're going to plateau. Everyone plateaus. And it's at that point that people have to start adjusting, volume, intensity, and frequency to see what works for them. If you can imagine kind of intensity, frequency, and volume as like sliders, and you kind of have to slide them up and down to figure out what is the best combination for you. And you have to kind of do an N=1 self-experimentation kind of over time to see what is going to work for you. And obviously, it's different adjustments and arrangements of those variables are going to work for you at different times in your training career, just to complicate matters further. But to keep it simple, most people are going to do really well on 1 to 2 sessions a week, full body routines. And that's something that's probably going to work for most people for, a very, very long time indeed, several years until they have to adjust to, if they get to a plateau where, maybe they're kind of close to their genetic potential, whatever that might be, and they want to kind of coax that last kind of 10, 20%, then they might have to start really getting into the nitty gritty and adjusting things. But I think, most people listening to this, they just want an effective, efficient workout protocol, which they can do maybe once a week or twice a week. Then I just think that's kind of window dressing and not that important at this stage.
Let's kind of zero in on the breathing here for each repetition, because I think this is an important part for you to talk about. Can you explain how that breathing should be for each repetition?
Absolutely. Another great question. So obviously, because you're not necessarily training in the conventional way where, for instance, a typical kind of conventional strength training workout might insist that you exhale during the concentric positive part of the exercise, and then you inhale during the negative. Well, because we're going to be moving relatively slow and slower than that, it doesn't probably make sense to take long breaths because you're going to find that very challenging to actually to do the exercise productively. So what Doug would advocate and what I advocate is very controlled, natural breathing. So just breathing in and out naturally, making sure that you're getting plenty of obviously oxygen into the lungs as you're doing the set. And then what you'll find is that once you get to the end of your set, so certainly when you start building up a lot of fatigue, it's going to be difficult to maintain that natural breathing. So what I like to do is it sounds aggressive, but it's probably could do with a better label, is force hyperventilate, which is kind of where you go like that. And that's better versus kind of a Valsalva maneuver where people hold their breath, because that could be quite dangerous for blood pressure and things like that. So I like to do that, that kind of rapid in and out style of breathing towards the end of my set so that I'm as productive as possible during the end of the set, but I'm also doing it in the safest way. I'm not holding my breath or trying not to hold my breath at any point. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That's helpful. Now, if people want to record or track their workouts, do you recommend that they do that? Do you do that for yourself?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So total workout time. So what you'd have to do is time when you begin the workout to when you finish, and that can obviously vary. I mean, it's not as accurate to add the time and the load for each exercise because you don't know how much rest you had between them. So it's also important to track when you started and when you finished your whole workout. You also want to track time and the load for each exercise. You obviously want to track the exercise, the settings if it's on a machine. You want to track the resistance used. Those are the key things. Obviously, the date. You want to know what day you train so that you don't train perhaps too frequently. And then you want to track all of those things every time you work out. Now, this is a really important thing that took me a while to understand is when you're training, especially after you've been training for a while. So at the beginning, you may get improvements every single workout. But when you've been training for a while, you will plateau. And at that point, it's not actually that useful to look at each of your workouts, workout by workout. It makes a lot more sense to take a kind of bird's eye view and actually look at your workouts in a longer term kind of context. So maybe look at, workout 1, and then look at workout 10. And if your numbers are significantly, if you're trending in the wrong direction, then maybe you need to make an adjustment. Maybe you need to have more recovery. Maybe you need to address some of the health hygiene aspects. Are you stressed out? Are you working long hours? Is your nutrition really bad? Are you sleeping poorly? All this stuff. Maybe you need to reduce your volume within your workout. So that's really the best way and the most kind of pragmatic and practical way to actually improve over the very long term. So if you're turning this type of protocol into a lifestyle choice for the entire training career, then that is the best way to do it. So look at your training over, 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, something like that, and just look at how you're trending. If the trend is going up in the right direction, if your time of the load is improving, if your weights and resistance are improving over the longer term, then keep doing what you're doing. It seems to be working. But if that's not the case, then it might be worth making some adjustments.
So in terms of switching up this program, what do you advise there? Do you recommend that beginners maybe stick with something for 8 to 10 weeks and then maybe switch it up later? How do you go about that? Yeah,
I honestly think that beginners could do something like the Body by Science Big 5 for probably as long as 3 to 6 months. I actually think that wouldn't necessarily need much change at all for that first kind of 3 to 6 months for most people. But after that, there are a few things you can do to, continue improving results. And then some people obviously like the novelty. They want to change for that reason. So that's more of a psychological thing. But you could opt to, so in Body by Science, Doug advocates kind of paring down the exercises, the workouts. So he would pare it down to a two-way split, which would basically split the Big 5 into maybe 2 workouts with 2 or 3 exercises. And then even, if you weren't improving based on that protocol, so doing that once a week or twice a week, then maybe paring that down further to a 3-way split. So all you're doing is you're giving your muscle groups a little bit more recovery in between sessions. So that's one way to go about it. I don't really have, a lot more to say in terms of changing the protocol. Doug is so one thing to bear in mind is that the Big 5 is just one protocol, right? It doesn't really matter. So long as you're addressing all of the main muscle groups, so long as you're addressing the full kind of musculature of the body, it's really not that important in terms of the exercises that you select, so long as they're safe. And that's the key thing. It's safety first and just making sure you're basically working the entire musculature. But the Big 5 is just one template to follow. I'm just trying to think of alternatives. You could throw in a pullover as an exercise. Like I've said, things like barbell presses, bent over rows on a bench. All of these exercises, you can look up on YouTube and design a protocol. I don't want to come across the Big 5 is the ultimate protocol. It's not. It's just one way of going about it. But the outcome that we're after is just fatiguing, all of the major muscle groups as effectively and safely as possible.
Right, and he likes to basically, he says he likes to stick to more of the compound exercises in general, right? But you don't have to, but that's what he recommends.
Yeah, exactly. So you can do single joint exercises. There's nothing wrong with that. Bicep curls are fine. I love a good bicep curl. So that is just completely down to personal preference. I suppose when he designed or not designed, but borrowed that template, and he's just thinking of what's the most effective way that we can get at all of the different muscle groups. And obviously compound exercises have been shown to, stimulate improvement across a large number of muscle groups in just a single exercise. So that's probably why they were kind of prioritized.
Right. And so then, just in general, like, who would you recommend this style of training for, and who would you not recommend it for?
I'm really biased. So I actually think that this style of training is for everyone, practically. I think it's great for the busy entrepreneur or corporate professional who doesn't have much time, because it's incredibly time efficient, safe, and it's just a very, very effective form of exercise. It improves muscle mass, strength, bone mineral density, insulin sensitivity, cardiovascular conditioning, all of that stuff, all the stuff you want to get out of what a workout should provide. It gives you that. So I think it's definitely more ideal than going for a jog down the street, for example.
Actually, Lawrence, stop right there, because you mentioned cardiovascular, and people are going to be like, what? Cardiovascular? How is this cardiovascular? Maybe you can kind of zero in on how this is getting that cardio effect.
Yeah, sure. So I think I will caveat what I'm saying, so that obviously I'm not an exercise scientist, but what my reading and experiences kind of led me to understand is that your heart and lungs and your cardiovascular system exist to serve your muscles. So if you're running up a hill or pushing on a leg press, your body doesn't really know the difference. All it knows is that you're doing a different type of mechanical work of muscle. And if anyone who's done weight training intensely will know, it's just how stimulated it is from a cardiovascular point of view. It really is. I mean, you're absolutely gassed after you've done an activity like that. And it's my belief that you will get the adaptations you're looking for in terms of improvements to your cardiovascular system, that as you would in strength training versus any other kind of steady state aerobic activity. If you look at Martin Jabala, who's one of the scientists at McMaster University, he's quite famous for a study that he did where he looked at steady state people versus people that did high intensity interval training for like 6 minutes a week. So he had those guys compared to like people that were training, 5-6 hours doing steady state jogging. And when he looked at the outcomes, they were basically the same. There was no benefit to doing a ton more frequency and volume versus doing just the intense 6-minute workout. So you're basically taking that high intensity interval training stimulus, but you're also adding onto it the fact that you're going to be fatiguing all of your musculature, because obviously high intensity interval training, if it's performed on a bike, for example, isn't necessarily going to get at inducing hypertrophy in the rest of your muscle groups, whereas a big 5 workout is going to deliver a similar response. So you're going to be absolutely gassed, but at the same time, you're going to be stimulating muscles. So hopefully that's kind of the way I explain it. I've had my my resting heart rate measured and all of that stuff. And, I've been doing this for years now, and I've seen no downside to switching to much, much less steady state activity and practically replacing that with high intensity strength training.
And why do you think this method of training is not more popular?
That's a very good question. I think it's a number of things. I think it's really hard. So I'm not going to lie and say that like this is easy. Like it's as I was alluding to earlier, like it's not comfortable. It's really hard to train to muscular failure. And I think a lot of people just don't want to apply that kind of effort. So I think that's one reason. I think the other reason is that the kind of mass media kind of health and fitness industry is just really, really poorly regulated. I think there's a lot of bad advice that's promoted and endorsed. And I just think that gets in the way, and people are kind of sold by these kind of get fit quick schemes and these workouts that are promoting just completely unrealistic rates of fat loss. And so I think that just doesn't help. I just don't think there's enough weight behind evidence-based resistance training or high intensity strength training, unfortunately, in the media, when there should be, because there's just nothing else. There's nothing else that beats it in terms of bang for your buck in a single session. There just isn't anything else that's evidence-based that comes anywhere near as close. So I hope that changes. But yeah, I think those are 2 main reasons why it's not taking off.
So you're not just into fitness and health. You're also passionate about being really productive when it comes to business and life. Can you share with us some of the big rocks that have made the biggest difference in those areas?
Yeah, for sure. I think a couple things. I'm a big Tim Ferriss fan and a big Peter Drucker fan. Peter Drucker is a time management theorist, a management theorist, and he's got a wonderful book called The Effective Executive, which basically talks about the importance of being effective instead of just focusing on being efficient. Something done well doesn't mean that it's important and going to get you closer to your goals. So often efficiency is very much overrated. And I used to be one of those people that if I was busy and just getting lots of stuff done and ticking off my to-do list, I felt like I was being productive, but really I wasn't being that productive at all. And more recently, probably within the last couple of years, I've always sat down at the beginning of the day and said, what are the one or two things that are actually going to get me closer to my goals and closer to hitting my KPIs or my targets, whatever they are. And those things tend to be uncomfortable. They tend to potentially there be some kind of confrontation or uncomfortable conversation, or they just kind of take a lot of resource, take a lot of thinking to actually orchestrate and then execute. But rest assured, if you can identify those as the first 10 minutes of your workday, and then literally block out your first few hours to tackle those things, I think you're going to be more productive than like 99% of people. I mean, I just have noticed that since I've changed my mindset and just focused on being effective over being efficient, my work output has been insane. I mean, this podcast is obviously an example of that. And on my podcast, I should say. So yeah, I think that's a big one for people. And obviously, to give you a real life example, when I was in sales, what I would do is I would kind of sit down and go, okay, what is the most important thing I can do that will actually impact my sales target? And so the question I used to ask myself, and I steal this directly from 4-Hour Workweek from Tim, is, what is the thing I can do that will get my biggest customer one step closer to signing a purchase order? And I would think about that question, and I think about what is the most high impact activity I could do in the first 2 hours of my day. And I would just do that. I'd make a discipline of doing that on a daily basis. And I got to a point where, I was the top sales guy in the company, but effectively I was really only working the morning. Hopefully my past employers won't listen to this, but there are obviously a few afternoons where I would just focus on my corporate warrior stuff and growing that blog and podcast. But yet I was still able to achieve and exceed my targets, even though sometimes I would only really work kind of, the morning, sort of 9 till 12, something like that. So hopefully that's helpful and something for people to ponder and look more into.
Great stuff. That's a lot of good advice that people can use. Just as a final wrap-up question, do you have any last words of wisdom or anything that you would like to leave our audience with?
I do. Just start doing some sort of strength training. It doesn't have to be high-intensity strength training. I mean, the most important thing is that you pick the exercise protocol that you're going to stick with, because unfortunately, the stats are insane. Like the actual number of people that actually do some type of resistance training, it's like 7%. And I think that's actually the stats in the US. I'm not sure. I think that's the US. Might be on a bigger scale, but it could be that. So, just find something that you enjoy, that you can sustain over the long term, because it doesn't have to be the most effective protocol. It just has to be some sort of resistance training workout that you need to do on a regular basis. So find something that works for you and just find something that you're going to adhere to and be consistent with it, and you'll get great results. But obviously you can't outwork a bad diet. So I do certainly advocate people look into eating a healthier diet. And for me, that would be generally higher in protein. So I am an advocate of kind of 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, and then focusing on very nutrient dense food. So that's your obvious, steak, fish, eggs, vegetables, and then trying to limit the kind of higher energy, less nutrient dense foods, like things like vegetable oils and obviously junk food and refined carbohydrate and stuff like that. So those would be some of my key takeaways.
I love it. If people want to learn more about you, where can they find you, Lawrence?
Yeah, so best place to go is corporatewarrior.org. And if you go there, you'll find a full list of all of my episodes. Obviously, that's the website. So there's a contact button there if you want to ping me an email. Always love receiving emails from people. And yeah, I suppose that'd be the best place to start.
Great stuff, Lawrence. Thank you for sharing all this amazing information, and thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Bill. I really appreciate it.
There it is. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Lawrence. This is just one of many different ways that you can add more movement into your life. Again, it's all about finding what works for you. So hopefully this gave you some good ideas. If you want the show notes to this episode and everything we discussed, just head over to anchorsofhealth.com/17. And if you want my key takeaways from every episode, you can sign up for my exclusive email list right there as well. All right, that's it for me. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.